Welcome everyone for joining us tonight. We have a great presentation tonight. We have Uncle Sam Can't Count is our webinar presentation by Dr. Burt Folsom. Before we get things started tonight, I'd like to share a word from our sponsors. Thomas and Martha Collins were generous enough to sponsor our lecture tonight, and I'd like to play a brief message from them to get things started here.
Good evening. The mission of the Political Economy Research Institute at MTSU is to increase the understanding of business and economic principles and their impact on the well-being of society. By extension, their programs show how capitalism has benefited all in this country and the world. Martha and I feel that the benefits of our free market system are not being adequately taught in schools, including the lower grades and universities. Likewise, our own generation has not shared often enough the lessons we learned from our life experiences. That while we prospered under capitalism, other nations that experienced with top-down government-run systems failed or stagnated. Those systems invariably led to harsh oppression and a decline in the wealth and well-being of their citizens. We feel that it is urgently important, especially in this time of pandemics, unrest, and the growing popularity of socialist ideas, that we step up and support this research institute and their programs. MTSU's formation of the Political Economy Research Institute is a step in the right direction. We believe the organization and its programs are good for the university, the country, good for our family, and for future generations. Given their important work, we are happy to provide our support for the Institute at MTSU by creating the M. Thomas Collins and Martha R. Collins Lectures in Free Enterprise.
At the end of this presentation, there's going to be a Q&A session, and in doing so, there's a Q&A tool at the bottom. We ask that you just please use that. We're not going to be doing any kind of live audio for the Q&A, so just utilize the Q&A session. Next up, I'd like to introduce the director of the Political Economy Research Institute, Dr. Dan Smith, and he's going to introduce our speaker tonight.
All right, thank you, Brian. All right, hi, welcome to the Political Economy Research Institute's M. Thomas and Martha Collins Lecture in Free Enterprise. We're very excited for you to join us. I would like to extend a personal thank you to Tom and Martha for making this lecture series possible. As a donor-funded initiative, we are dependent on local donors like them to continue to fund student programming, such as the exciting event we have lined up tonight. So thank you, Tom and Martha, for investing in advancing our societal understanding of free enterprise. I would also like to thank Brian Delaney and Henrietta Bailey for handling all the behind-the-scenes details and execution of this event. The Political Economy Research Institute was started in 2016. It's a joint venture between the Jenny Nate Jones College of Business and the University Honors College, established with initial seed money from the Charles Koch Foundation. Our mission is to engage undergraduate and graduate students with faculty and research that furthers our understanding of business and economic principles, as well as their impact on regional, national, and international financial conditions and the well-being of society. To advance this mission, the Political Economy Research Institute engages in research and educational programs such as this, which uncover the institutions and policies that encourage and enhance human well-being. As Tom and Martha noted, the free enterprise system has played a central role in advancing human betterment. Today, we're going to learn how hard it is for government actors to overcome the stark knowledge and incentive problems they face in attempting to intervene in or even try to replicate the market process, oftentimes resulting in costly follies that undermine economic freedom and human well-being. Now, before we go on to that, I do want to mention that our upcoming events for the fall semester will all be virtual and open to the public. They include Radley Balco, a columnist for the Washington Post, who will be giving a talk on reforming policing in Tennessee on September 22nd at 4:30. Mayor Glenn Jacobs of Knox County. He'll be giving a talk on October 15th on being mayor during COVID-19. And then Matt Ridley, the author of The Rational Optimist, will be giving a talk, How Innovation Works and Why It Flourishes in Freedom. The date and time is to be determined. Without further ado, let's get to the main event. Dr. Burt Folsom Jr. was a history professor for 34 years, 14 of those years with Hillsdale College in Michigan, where he is now a distinguished fellow. Folsom also serves as an economic historian at nearby Kennesaw State University's Bagwell Center for the Study of Markets and Economic Opportunity. He's the author of 10 books, including The Myth of the Robber Barons, one of my all-time favorite books, The New Deal or Raw Deal, How FDR's Economic Legacy Has Damaged America, The Spirit of Freedom, Essays in American History, The Industrial Revolution and Free Enterprise, and Empire Builders. I was actually gifted a copy of that book by a mutual friend of ours at the age of 16, and it was truly transformative in my development. Dr. Folsom's talk will be on his book, Uncle Sam Can't Count, co-authored with his wife, Anita Folsom. Dr. Folsom, we're excited to have you join us tonight.
Thank you, Dan. I'm delighted to be here. And I wish I could be with all of you in person. When Dan and I were trying to set this up many months ago, we were aiming to have me on campus and I could be with you, I could meet with you, answer your questions. But hey, this is the best we can do here, and I'm glad to be here and at least be able to talk with you and take questions at the end of my talk. Now, the title here, Uncle Sam Can't Count, is the book, but the topic that I want to talk with you on is one that's of interest to everybody. How did the United States become a world power? What were the economic factors that helped the United States rise to the top? And if you look at, I mean, it doesn't take any accident to see today. I was writing now just a list of some of the major companies today that illustrate that the United States is a major player. Even in the midst of this COVID-19, the United States is powerful. Look at, I mean, in computers, you have Apple, but you have related types of industries, Netflix, PayPal, Amazon. All of this is very recent, and the United States is right at the forefront. In cars, now not as much with the United States nowadays as we had maybe 40, 50 years ago, but still Tesla, the electric cars are doing well. If you look at airplanes, you know, Boeing is a major producer in the world. Look at military weaponry, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin. And then you look at things like retail with Walmart, or food production with McDonald's and Coca-Cola. The United States, in just an abundance of industries, is dominating in most of the world. And therefore, some of you have seen our unemployment statistics have really improved in the last quarter. There's so many avenues for people to be employed and be effective that the United States today is a world power, and it has much opportunity. Now, I want to look at this because 200 years ago, when the United States was a young country, say the year 1820, what industries? I want you to think about this. I'm not here to ask you and call on someone, but just think about this for a minute. What industries did the United States prevail or dominate the world in 200 years ago? The answer is zero. And which is interesting because I just read off that list of industries which are dominating from the United States. Now, we did have farming. We were farm exporters. We had a lot of wheat and corn that we exported. But even there, we didn't have the invention of the reaper, the tractor. Our agriculture was not mechanized in any way. We were not leading in the Industrial Revolution. We were way behind Great Britain. Great Britain and Germany and France, to a lesser extent, were areas of the world that were dominant. Great Britain in textiles. They were the first ones to mechanize a major industry, textiles, with the mechanical looms, and were able to make shirts and clothing. And that was a major triumph in economic history. Steel was dominated by Britain also. Then you've got like railroads, invented in Britain, dominated by Britain. The United States is way behind. In fact, the first time we had a textile industry, it was in Rhode Island. And the way we got it was somebody who lived in England migrated over here, who knew about textiles, and took that knowledge with him and set up a textile industry. Not a very good commentary on our native-born entrepreneurs. We had to literally import someone who knew something about it. The United States was lagging way behind. Our Constitution did not permit much government intervention in the economy. We relied on freedom and on entrepreneurs. And the idea here is that with free markets, with entrepreneurs, and the freedom that comes with entrepreneurs, and by that I mean the low taxes, patents to protect inventions, this kind of thing, that is the way to produce prosperity. And the freedom, first of all, is an end in itself, but it also is a means to prosperity. Now, that was the prevailing theory in the United States. We had occasional exceptions, but that's the prevailing theory. We get to the Civil War in the 1860s, and the United States is still second rate. Only it's worse because we just went through a civil war. We're ripping up the rails of some of the few railroads that we have in the South in particular. We have people on North and South killed, major people, young people who could potentially have contributed greatly to inventing products and contributed to American life, dead. We had a huge debt from the war, and I'm going to get into that. So that we were behind before the war, we're more behind after the war. As the war was in the process of being concluded, with, of course, a victory for the North, President Abraham Lincoln was trying to look forward. And he had some consultants, and he was talking with people, and he said, is this time to change the American dynamic? At least for a while. We've been relying on free markets, and we're way behind. There's another point of view here, and Abraham Lincoln was looking into it. And that point of view is you put aside freedom and free markets a little bit, and you use the government to come in, pick an industry, concentrate capital into that industry, tax dollars if necessary. You go in and pick out entrepreneurs who look like they're going to be really able in that field. Then you turn them loose, and then you catch up with England. That's what Abraham Lincoln was looking into. In other words, what I'm saying is we have two theories of growth. Two theories of economic development are going to be competing after the Civil War. One is freedom, turn the entrepreneurs loose in a free system, and they will produce products that will increase the standard of living of the whole country. Then there was what Abraham Lincoln was looking into, and that is the idea, at least in this industry, railroads, to have government concentrate a lot of capital into a transcontinental railroad. It was going to be named, many of you know it, I mean, it's a company that Warren Buffett has been involved with even in the last decade or so, the Union Pacific Railroad. The idea is that we pick out someone, Abraham Lincoln picked out a good railroad man, a guy who was considered an expert, especially on railroads out west. Grenville Dodge was his name. The idea is we pick Dodge, some others, we give them a lot of money, and then we put them in charge of building the railroad. The idea is when the railroad is successful, the United States will expand from coast to coast with transportation across from Boston to San Francisco. And then the United States will rise. It will increase our economic development, it'll improve our transportation, our ability to get goods back and forth. Then we can catch up with England. We're going to reject, for at least for a while, method number one with the free markets. And we're going to try the government intervention, the government support for the transcontinental railroads, the Union Pacific Railroad. Lincoln made this statement to Grenville Dodge. I want to quote this, and others who were head of the Union Pacific Railroad. I want to read this. I don't want to get anything misquoted. He said this: If the government subsidies provided are not enough to build the Union Pacific, ask double and you shall have it. Ask double and you shall have it if that's not enough. Now, I'm just thinking about this. When I was teaching at Hillsdale College, I never had my president come up to me and say to me, Burt Folsom, we have faith in you. If you need a higher salary, ask double and you shall have it. Had I been asked that question, and I wish I had, but I never was, my answer would be, yes, I would like to have double. And I say that because I can't really criticize Grenville Dodge and his Oaks Ames and the others that were leading the Union Pacific when they said, yes, increase our subsidy. And what I'm saying is that the subsidy to fund the Union Pacific Railroad and also the Central Pacific, because we're going to have the Union Pacific starting in Omaha and it's going to be moving westward. Then the Central Pacific is starting in California. It's going to move eastward, see? So two sides are both going to get subsidies and they're going to meet in the middle somewhere. But the thing is, they'll have incentives to be quick because they're competing with another railroad. So that way, right, we can get it built quickly. And so we've got two railroads, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, competing for subsidies. And the estimate was, when all of this would be done, that it would be these federal subsidies for these transcontinentals would be about $60 million. Now, to put that in perspective, because money back then was worth a whole lot more than it is today. The US national debt in 1860 was $60 million. And it's going to cost $60 million for this railroad. That is the level of confidence that Lincoln had, and many others. I don't just want to say Lincoln, that this was the time to call upon government. Entrepreneurs had to be put aside. We do the government, they build the railroad, then the United States prospers. And after the help from the government, then we can start thinking about maybe letting entrepreneurs go from there, but maybe we'll have more government, who knows? But anyway, we're going to experiment with an alternate solution to free enterprise, concentrate capital in these transcontinental railroads, turn the entrepreneurs loose, and prosperity will result. We're going to double the national debt, but it's worth it because we'll tie our country together. The Union Pacific and their building, and with the Central Pacific, turned out to be one of the most colossal disasters that ever occurred in American history. And let me explain how this happened. When the government gets involved in a project, the incentives start to change in ways that are often very bad for efficiency and prosperity. We were paying the railroads, Union Pacific going west, Central Pacific going east. They're coming together and they're going to meet. Now we have a mountain range in between. We're going to be paying them. Remember, Lincoln said, if you need double, ask for it. So we're going to be paying high rates to go across. Across flat land, we were paying 16, which is Nebraska and part of Colorado. We were paying $16,000 a mile. Then it went up to as much as $48,000 a mile when you hit the mountains, the Rocky Mountains. And then both railroads owners are going to have those incentives. What the Union Pacific discovered was that as they were building across Nebraska, it was costing them much less than $16,000 a mile to build each mile of railroad. Now, what that meant to them was, gee, isn't it a shame when we run out of Nebraska? Because we're making so much money while we're in there. That means that the railroad going across Nebraska began to take this shape. Here it's coming. It's curving around. Because see, if you go like this, you get more mileage. In other words, the incentives that the government put in place were, they said, well, we want you to build it efficiently and quickly, so we're going to pay you by the mile. All of a sudden, the railroad was built a little bit like this, which meant it took a long time to get out of Nebraska. The Union Pacific made a boatload of cash, the leaders of it, but it was a very poorly built railroad. I was talking about this one time before a group of adults that were, they were business people, and I was trying to get down to the nitty gritty with them. And I had one guy raise his hand and say, Mr. Folsom, I spent my life working for the Union Pacific Railroad. And everybody in the room turned and looked at him and looked at me and waited for what was to come. And he looked at me and said, yes, I've spent a lifetime working for the Union Pacific, and we're still trying to figure out how to straighten that railroad out. Because once it got here like this, it was hard to straighten it out, because then the land that made it would have been the land they should have chosen started going up in value, and you can't really buy that land to redo the railroad very easily, and the whole thing was a mess. Once the Union Pacific then got to the Rocky Mountains, the Central Pacific was also coming along here too. And the Union Pacific leaders thought, oh my gosh, we've got to get through these mountains. And, the mountains go up and they go down. So wherever there's an up, there's got to be a down. And they were trying to work their way. And they did not get a good route through the mountains, which meant it was a high grade. And it was hard to run a train through the mountains because the grade was so high. But the Union Pacific said, even though it's a bad grade, that we're having to, it's tilted too much uphill, it's still good for us to do it, because by the time we get down the hill and get back onto flatter land, we can start making lots of money again. If we sit there and try to find where the best route is, by the time we figure it out, the Central Pacific will be right at the other end of the mountain and we won't get any more money. And so the Union Pacific went through the mountain at a very poor place. They ended up coming through. It was not a very good grade. And they then were sprinting all the way to the West Coast. And the Central Pacific was coming as well. Now, one thing that the Union Pacific was doing to help them build that railroad, to make the grade flatter, was to use dynamite. Because you could do dynamite, you could kind of blow up some areas that are hilly, and then you could flatten it a little bit. The Union Pacific could have written a book, Dynamite, Its Uses and Abuses. The uses are to blow up those hills to get the flat grade. The abuses turned out to be when the Union Pacific leaders and some of their employees in the middle of the night took their dynamite, sneaked all the way over to the Central Pacific Railroad, blew their railroad tracks up, quickly got back to the Union Pacific, and then the Union Pacific said they can't get credit for that railroad they built because it doesn't exist anymore. Now, here's one of those situations in life that you ask the question, I wonder what the Central Pacific did about that. What did they do? If I were to ask you all a multiple choice question on a test and say, what do you think the Central Pacific did about having their tracks blown up? Here would be my choices for answers. A, they turned the other cheek and said nothing. B, they said, aw shucks, and then rebuilt the railroad. C, they sneaked over in the middle of the night to the Union Pacific Railroad and blew their tracks up. If you answered C to that question, you are correct. That's exactly what they did. And so we had both sides blowing up the tracks of the other side, taking the money they got from the federal government to build, blowing the other side's tracks up, and finally Congress had to get involved. And they said, nobody, the congressman came in there, now we've been giving you money, nobody gets any more money. if you're going to go blowing each other's tracks up, nobody gets any more money. And so neither side wanted to have the subsidy time end. It was goody time, making lots of money. They were getting very rich. Even having to expend extra money for the dynamite, they were still getting wealthy. And so they didn't want those subsidies to go away, so they quit blowing each other's track up. Now, they're getting closer. Union Pacific, they're getting closer. Look at this. They're getting closer. They refused to meet. They paralleled each other, and both of them claimed credit for the mileage that they were paralleling one another. They didn't want to meet because when they met, they'd get no more subsidies. President Johnson, many others had to get involved and say, no, 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 you're not going to be both paid for track that's paralleling. You have to meet at Promontory Point, Utah. And nobody gets any more mileage other than Promontory Point, Utah. So they both went into Promontory Point, Utah. They met. The heads of both railroads took a swing at the golden spike to do the last spike into the rail to connect the railroad. Both of them took the hammer over their head, whack, and missed. Finally, a foreman whacked the golden spike in. They had a huge celebration. So often there's a picture in textbooks that shows it. Somebody stole the golden spike, but they got it back. I want to say that they got it back. No permanent stealing of the golden spike. And now we have our first transcontinental railroad, and it put the United States, instead of being $60 million in debt, we're now $120 million. But we have a railroad that you can't really run trains easily back and forth because of the bad grade in the mountainous area. So it's hard to take one train from the West Coast to Omaha and back to the East Coast because there's so many problems with the train going through the Rocky Mountains. And that's the story of our first transcontinental railroad. Now, one person who was observing this and thinking it was just ridiculous was a man named James J. Hill. James J. Hill was an immigrant to the United States, and he said, I'm going to build a competing railroad. And he did. He built the Great Northern Railroad, starting in Minnesota, St. Paul, going all the way to Seattle. It was higher. It was above the Union Pacific. And he said, I'm going to do it with no federal subsidies. He was an immigrant. He had lost use of his right eye. He lost it in a bow and arrow accident as a kid. He was not someone going around, oh, I'm handicapped, I can't do anything. He said, I believe that I am destined to accomplish great things. He moved to the United States to do it, and he began building the Great Northern Railroad with no federal subsidies. And he said the thing that the Union Pacific did that was, among other things, that was really foolish is they built where there were no people. I'm just going to keep building along and encourage settlement. And so I'll build into North Dakota and get farm products and encourage farmers to come in. Then he built eventually into Montana and he found copper. And so there were a lot of people who came in there to mine the copper. Then he moved westward and there was lumber industry in the Seattle area. And so lumber people came in to export lumber all over the country to build houses. He built that railroad slowly, methodically, and surely with zero federal subsidies. He arrived in Seattle. And when he did so, he had the best built transcontinental in the country. The way he got through the Rocky Mountains was he went back to the books of Lewis and Clark. Remember, they were the first Americans to go through that area under Thomas Jefferson, President Jefferson, exploring. He said, how did they get through? And he said they talked about a Marias Pass. And so he went out and found this Marias Pass that was a flat grade through the mountains. He had the best built railroad in the United States. It was most efficient railroad. And once it was completed, he got a huge amount of the traffic. His market share was absolutely huge. The Union Pacific went into bankruptcy. They couldn't compete with him. They had to be rebought and resold. And we had this great Transcontinental Railroad. It was built privately by James J. Hill. It was much more successful than the federally built Transcontinental Railroad. And as a result of that, you hear sometimes, I'm a history professor, and it's sad how we do not learn from history. But I want to say this, for a generation, we are going to have people who said, aha, I learned from history. We are not going to do any more government subsidies. We reduced the role of government. We reduced it so much, President Grant came in and he said, we're going to have balanced budgets, no more subsidies for railroad building or anything else like that. I mean, we had occasional tariffs, but generally it was very limited government. And we had, with that limited government, Grant eliminated the income tax. So we didn't even have an income tax. And we had a debt from the Civil War and the Transcontinentals of $3 million. We had 28 straight years of budget surpluses. We reduced the national debt almost below $1 billion. It went from 3 million to below 1 billion. And we turned our entrepreneurs loose. They said, look, America may rise, America may fall. We may never catch up with Great Britain. Whether we do or we don't, it's going to be up to our entrepreneurs. And let me tell you what they accomplished. Once we got the government completely out, number one, in the 1870s, we have the invention of the telephone, Alexander Graham Bell. After that, we get Thomas Edison, who comes in the 1880s. He had multiple inventions. Electricity, the light bulb were magnificent. They changed the world in so many ways. And he invented the phonograph. Yeah, music. Think of Thomas Edison, the music industry, phonograph. And the movies. He had the first projectors. They were called Nickelodeons. They were a little short, and you pay a nickel to see it. Movies in the 1890s. And so we have those inventions. In other words, this period of the late 1800s becomes an incredible period of American growth. We have, as I mentioned, the telephone. Then we get Thomas Edison with multiple inventions. And I'm just hitting the highlights here, the phonograph and the electricity and movies. But listen, the typewriter comes in. Something we take for granted, the QWERTY, QWERTY, that was invented by Christopher Sholes when he invented the typewriter in the 1870s. We have the invention of the typewriter. We have the invention of the adding machine in 1885 by a man named William Burroughs. Think about that. And that may not seem like just a really wow invention, but look at all these people working at corporate headquarters. Before 1885, they had to add columns of figures by hand. Now you could punch buttons and add them in. It increases the ability of Americans to live efficient economic lives if you're in a corporate setting. And so the adding machine is important. Then in the 1890s, Herman Hollerith comes in. You don't hear much about him. He invents the computer. He uses the typewriter as a keyboard, and he uses the adding machine, and he has these. These are cards that are punch cards. They're little holes. I don't know if you can see that. They're little holes, and you punch in, and you'd have categories. You'd ask people. He did this for the census. The computer was first used for the census. You know, male or female, and you punch one in. They'd have different categories for your job, different categories for your age, and all of these things. And they'd have it all on these punch cards. Then every person would have, whose data would be on this punch card, would be put into the computer. And we did the census in record time. And it was the forerunner to IBM. The United States is going to be taking the lead in computers, even in the late 1800s. We have that invented. What about the automobile? Henry Ford in the 1890s. Henry Ford knew we wanted cars. He knew people wanted cars before they knew they wanted them. It's like Steve Jobs. He knew I wanted my iPhone before I knew I wanted an iPhone. I didn't go around telling anybody, I want this iPhone because you can have my music and I can have my phone and I can have all sorts of emails on it. No. He did it, and then I thought, wow, and bought one. Henry Ford, it's the same way. People wanted faster horses. They wanted better carriages. Ford said, I'm thinking in different patterns, and because I'm an entrepreneur, give me a chance. Ford had his chance. He became a billionaire, the second billionaire in U.S. history. John D. Rockefeller was the first. Henry Ford was the second. And after this billion-dollar industry that Henry Ford got going, the United States is leading in automobiles. By the way, that sets us up pretty well for the 20th century with computers and cars. Those are the two biggest businesses of the 20th century. Both have American inventors. Both have Americans jumping off to a good start. And so you have all of this. And by the end of the century, the United States had become a world power. A world power. A leading economic power. And you might say, I have here, listen, you might say, well, what about charity and all these things? The government was not needed. We had the founding of the Red Cross, because if people had businesses that were burned out, we'd have charities that would come in to help them. The Salvation Army was also invented to help people in distress. The Humane Society for animals, orphanages for kids who had parents who died. We have orphanages. And I want to think about colleges too. Entrepreneurs set up colleges. One of them's right near you, Vanderbilt University. After Cornelius Vanderbilt, the first American to be worth $100 million and a big railroad man. Gallup Debt. You say, well, what about deaf people? Gallup Debt, founded by Alexander Graham Bell in Washington, D.C. for deaf people. I'm talking to you from Atlanta. John D. Rockefeller set up Spelman College. He said, Rockefeller was the first billionaire in the oil industry, and he said, the smartest thing I ever did was make Jesus Christ my Savior. The second smartest thing I ever did was marry Laura Spelman. And he named this college Spelman College for Black women after his wife. And we had Booker T. Washington with Tuskegee for men, and he said, what about the women? So he sets up a college for Black women. In other words, what I'm telling you is entrepreneurs are on the scene. They're starting lots of charities as well as businesses. And the United States, low poverty rate relative to the world, high industrial rate, and we become a dominant power in the world. And that leads me to the last part of my talk. And that is the invention of the airplane. The invention of the airplane. Now, with this invention of the airplane, we have people on the scene who are saying, I know that private enterprise really outshined the transcontinentals. I know that the transcontinental railroads funded by the government flopped. Then we had a private transcontinental by James J. Hill that worked. That showed us the way. And then with electricity, telephones, all of this, we went with entrepreneurs. They invented this stuff. The United States is now the world leader. But airplanes, maybe we ought to try getting back to the government. And this is my final story for this evening. The story of the airplane. Now, here is the argument. Teddy Roosevelt, by the way, was making this argument. President McKinley was receptive to it around 1900. And we had all sorts of arguments going on here that we needed to have the federal government get back in this instance, for the airplane. And the argument is this. People in Germany and France are experimenting with the airplane, and Britain too. They're having their own state funding of those airplanes. If they invent an airplane before we do in the United States, they can get in their airplane, come over to the United States, and drop bombs on the United States, and there's nothing we can do about it. We've got to be first. We've got to beat them. But they're giving money to their entrepreneurs to do it. And I know that our entrepreneurs are good, they said. But look at, some of them are sitting around trying to figure out how to invent cigarettes and improve that, or chewing gum. We need to concentrate and get money to the best entrepreneur possible to invent the airplane. There was a debate over this in Congress, but they thought maybe this is one of those instances that we need government subsidies to help invent the airplane. If we can find someone who's really good at it. The person who was heads and shoulders above anybody else was a man named Samuel Langley. He had written a book called Experiments in Aerodynamics. It was considered the book on aerodynamics and airplane building. He had built a model airplane and had it, one without a person on it, a small one. And he flew it across the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. And when he did that with a little motor on it and it flew across, a lot of people said, there's the guy to do on a big scale what he just did on a small scale. Samuel Langley was head of the Smithsonian Institution. He already had to his credit some inventions. He had honorary degrees from Oxford, from Cambridge, from Harvard, and from Yale. He was considered probably America's preeminent scientist and an expert on aerodynamics. Langley was brought before Congress and he said yes. They asked him, could he build an airplane? He said, yes, I will be glad to receive the subsidy to build this airplane. He asked for enough money to have 2 tries. He was a very confident man. He said, even I might not make it on the first try. Isn't that something? He said, even I might not make it. I might not need a second try too. So he wanted enough funding to give him 2 tries. Congress voted him the money, and Samuel Langley in 1900 is going to begin building what was expected to be America's first airplane. He had a pilot who he hired. He had to be Ivy League, by the way. It was from Cornell University. It was always elite with Samuel Langley. He began building. One of the things that would surprise you if you were to see Langley, because he worked a lot on the engine, and of course he had the wings and all of this and the propeller. But you would be surprised because he was building it to be not, I know you think of a runway and that sort of thing, and an airfield. There was no airfield or runway. His airplane was going to be shot like out of how many have played Angry Birds? You've seen that? You shoot that, it was going to be an Angry Birds type of deal. You shoot it off some lift ramp, and the ramp, you go up and boom, you shoot it off that. And then, see, Langley's theory was, he had a houseboat in the middle of the Potomac, and he had his airplane there, and he was going to shoot it off this ramp. And the idea is you've got this engine going, and once it's shot into the air, the engine will then shoot it forward. And he said the only trouble there will be making sure you guide it. So he had a compass sewn in the pants of his pilot so he could see as he was flying up there where he was going and could come back and land somewhere around the Potomac. He had all the reporters in Washington were gathering around. And before he launched his airplane, he had a 21-gun salute. Boom, boom, to let everybody know, here it comes. America's ready to invent the airplane. Samuel Langley is here. And then it took place after the guns had fired. Everybody watched on the ramp. And the plane was shot up and went, boom! Boom, crash right into the water, right into the Potomac. It was a total disaster. In fact, I was reading and researching this for my chapter in the book, Uncle Sam Can't Count. For the chapter on the Wright Brothers, I was reading and I thought the Washington Post is the paper of record. And what they said was, the Washington Post, any 15-year-old boy could skim a rock much further. In other words, the plane did not fly at all. Anybody could even throw a rock and it would be further than that. It was a disaster. But Langley said, aha, I told you I have a second try. And he had a second try, and he fished the the pilot who was there, I mean, he did live through it. They got him out. He agreed to do the next one. And the next one was launched on December 8th, 1903. And on that day, we got the ramp ready. The second try was there. This time we didn't have a 21 gun salute. We just had the pilot there and he was ready to go. And you go, boom, it's in the air. Right into the water again. The pilot barely made it out alive. He almost drowned. This time, the newspapers were not so friendly. The Boston Herald said, Mr. Langley needs to abandon airplanes and try his hand at submarines. The New York Times made this statement. The problem is we're just not technologically ready for an airplane. If all the engineers and mathematicians in the United States, those are the two groups, engineers and mathematicians, worked steadily on this for 1 million years, maybe we will have an airplane invented. The New York Times, with their million-year calculation, was off the mark. They missed it by 999,999 years and 356 days. 9 days after Langley's second splash into the ground, the Wright brothers, two non-college educated bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, with $2,000 of their own money, no federal funds, went to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina for a few summers, experimenting. You know, it really was more in the winter months, and they were experimenting with gliders. They were watching birds. They were trying to design wings that would replicate more what a bird does. They were experimenting with gliders off of a hill. And finally, they got their engine. And it was a manned flight. They had Orville and Wilbur Wright, they take turns. One of them, you guided the airplane with your hand, you guided the rudder with your feet, and you had the engine. And there in December 1903, the Wright brothers made the first flight. The longest flight that they made that day was not 59 seconds, but they finally flew. They said, we've done it, and we're going to wait until we can commercially make this profitable. 5 years later, they got so they could fly hours. You know, there weren't too many people who wanted 59-second flights from one place to another. But when you're up in the air for 3 hours, now that's something a little bit different. So they got so they could do 3 hours in the air. And then they said, we'd like to sell our airplane to the government for $25,000 and make some money. The government had a choice, however, because Samuel Langley said, I need a third try and I will be successful. My method of flight has not been adequately exhausted yet. So we had a choice. We could either fund Langley, we could buy the Wright brothers airplane, or the French came in and offered to sell a balloon. A helium, well, it was hydrogen back then, hydrogen pumped balloon. And they said, that's the wave of the future, are these balloons. So if you're looking for national defense, the balloon is better than an airplane. So now the US government is going to make a choice. And I urge you just to think about this. They're in your seats. Do you think the government chose the balloon, the Wright brothers, or a third subsidy to Langley? When I've asked this before many audiences and asked for a raise of hands, a show me your hands, a lot of people say Langley, and I'm happy to report that is not correct. In fact, one congressman said, the only thing Langley ever made fly was government money. Langley was rejected. Nope, they rejected Langley. They chose the helium balloon. They rejected the Wright Brothers too, and they bought the helium balloon. But there was something that was suspicious going on here, because they noticed that the French brought the Wright Brothers over to give a test run because they were going to buy the airplane. And so some of the people, even in the government, began to think, wait a minute here. They sold us the balloon, but they're thinking of buying the airplane. And so when the French were trying to buy the airplane, also then the government bought the airplane. And so we also had an airplane as well as the balloon in our defense system. Now, this illustrates, and I'm ready for questions in just a minute here. This illustrates when you try government-run enterprises, they not only have a track record of failure, and I use these two as prime examples, the transcontinental railroads and the airplane. But when you compare with free enterprise, there are differences. There are reasons why, for example, that Edison succeeded and why Alexander Graham Bell succeeded, why Herman Hollerith succeeded with a computer, why William Burroughs succeeded with adding machines, why Henry Ford succeeded with the automobile, and why the government produced enterprises failed. Because the subsidy often creates a perversion of incentives. It gives you an incentive to use the incentive and leverage to get more subsidy rather than try to produce a product that absolutely works. And also, government has a notoriously poor record of picking people to receive the subsidy because it often becomes a political decision. And also, you can never tell who is going to emerge to be the real entrepreneur. And in a free market system, whoever is the best gets the most sales. And that's an open invitation for people who may have a disadvantage in life to use their resources to try to produce something better. They have incentives to excel. When you're just handing a subsidy to someone, the incentives to excel are not quite the same. Our experiments with government intervention have been terribly unsuccessful subsidizing economic development. The reason we prospered and became a first-rate power in the late 1800s is because we abandoned the government, we reduced the role of the federal government, and instead we turned our entrepreneurs loose in a free system. And those entrepreneurs, from Edison to Ford, to Herman Hollerith, to William Burroughs, to Alexander Graham Bell, were incredibly successful. And the United States, our country, rises to become a world power. Thank you. Let's have some questions.
All right, thank you, Dr. Folsom. That was great. We've got the first question from James. I'm just going to read it to you. You appear to have arrived at core beliefs that most of tonight's participants believe in a way by studying history. I'm curious, have your thoughts been influenced by Smith, Locke, von Mises, and Hayek?
Yes. How about all of the above? But you know what? A lot of this, those people were really helpful to me. I read Road to Freedom when I was in college, very helpful. Adam Smith is not only an excellent economist, but I find him very readable. And so you have that. Now, James, those influenced me. But as a historian, I have to say, I was influenced before I even got much to the Economists. I was just influenced by studying these events and looking at the history. In other words, I was looking at transcontinental railroads that failed, and I looked at one that succeeded. And I can remember when I did that, I began my study and I said, I want to find out why that federal railroad failed and why the private one succeeded. Or at least I want to look into some of the details. And with the airplane, it's sort of the same thing. And so once I began to see what factually was happening, in other words, what does the evidence look like? Then I began to do more reading saying, has anybody else began to talk about these things in a theoretical way that helps put them into perspective? And that's when I really got help from the Economists. That's when, so Adam Smith is just absolutely excellent because he's writing right there at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And he talks about division of labor and a pin factory. And and I found that excellent. Hayek is talking about the problems that occur whenever you put an elite over in charge of decisions. And so I find, a lot of it, the economists actually have this better than the historians. I was not able to get very much help in understanding the rise of the United States. Which is a huge topic and so important. I did not get much help from historians. Most of the theoretical help that I got that helps explain this was from economists.
Okay, we have another question. Do you believe that the failure of Jay Cook and Company was also a major contributor to the rise of free enterprise?
Jay Cook? Yeah, there, of course, you get what you got there is he's a political entrepreneur and he's trying to corner the gold market. And yes, the failure of, you have some people who try to get ahead by getting government money and competing on the basis of maintaining that money. I'd say this with industries sometimes that are helped by a protective tariff too. Once an industry has a protective tariff in place, then you try to use your political influence to keep the tariff rather than trying to produce a better product. And so, yeah, Cook was an example of a political entrepreneur operating in the 1860s. And Ulysses S. Grant saw right through him. He got really not very far with the White House at all. And President Grant was a free market guy. And he said, look, Grant was just looking at the economics. He said, look, before the Civil War, we have a debt of 60 million. After the Civil War, we have a debt of 3 billion, and the annual interest rate on that is 120 million. In other words, the annual interest payment is twice as big as the entire debt before the war. Are we just going to capitulate and go downhill as a country? Or are we going to get the industry that's going to rise to support that? He made the decision and others were with it. We're going to do it, and the Jay Cooks, the Union Pacific people are going to be eliminated. His vice president, Grant's vice president, you talk about Jay Cook, his first vice president that Grant had received stock free of charge from the Union Pacific. He was sacked and he was out, no more as vice president. He got a new vice president to run with him a second time. We had an attitude, and I applaud Grant, but the Democrats were also good. Grover Cleveland, the only Democratic president of the late 1800s. He came in and he said, look, any bill that I sign has to pass muster as being a good bill and consistent with the Constitution. And there was a bill that came in to give financial relief to farmers in Texas who had gone through a drought. He said, no, that's not the way the Constitution works. You don't have government help people. Once you have government helping people, it's political. You have people help people. Let me make a contribution to these farmers, and I urge others to do so as well. So those farmers were bailed out by private help. And Cleveland said, that's the way we do it. We had actually a consensus among presidents, Republican and Democrat alike, that America works best with private enterprise. The failure of the Union Pacific and the success of Thomas Edison and Henry Ford were an in-your-face thing that we couldn't miss and we didn't miss.
Okay, we have another comment from, there's two James, but this is James number 2. I was born in a farm. Yeah, James number 2. I was born in a farmhouse without electricity. He says TVA changed that, the Tennessee Valley Authority. I graduated from MTSU, a state-supported school. And he says, I think there's a balance to this topic that you missed. So I guess my question would be, didn't the TVA or the Hoover Dam, for example, bring electricity to impoverished Americans?
I like having that question because we need questions that are going to look at projects that provide at least a possible alternate view. the part of Tennessee that you are in, and that goes into Western Tennessee and Western Kentucky, is heavily funded by the TVA. Those areas have received incredible funding from the Tennessee Valley Authority. When I taught school for many years at Murray State University in Western Kentucky, that question came up from students, and therefore I thought, you know what, that's a good question. I went to visit the TVA and study it. The study was interesting because what we find, first of all, if you, there's a point in which James number 2 is absolutely right, and the point is this. If we tax everybody in the United States and we concentrate the benefits in the Middle Tennessee area all the way up to colleges like Austin P and Murray State, and we bring all of that in, is that going to help those regions? And the answer is, yeah, it very well might. Right? In other words, if the people in California and Boston and everybody are paying money into this one little area, are the people living in that area going to get help? And the answer is yes. And I'll tell you something, we had senators in those states, McKellar in Tennessee, and Senator Alban Barkley, the Senate Majority Leader from Western Kentucky, who are all for plowing money into their districts. And so the Tennessee Valley gets in there. Now, what's interesting, it's true. So in other words, I lived, and when I was there, I had lower electricity rates than people elsewhere because the government was paying the subsidy. In fact, I was almost kicked off the podium once because people said, he's getting a subsidy, he's violating. I said, well, look, I live there. I'm just receiving what's natural. And if you're there, your politicians did a good job of getting other people to pay money so you can benefit. But then the question that's interesting is what would happen in the absence of the TVA? And we have a study by a guy, I think his first name is Harold, his last name is Chandler. It's a book on the TVA. I cite it in my book, FDR Goes to, or New Deal or Raw Deal. And he looked at the TVA area and it received the money. And he said, one of the interesting things he observed is that area of northern Alabama and western Tennessee and western Kentucky that received all that federal funding had lower economic development than North Carolina and Georgia, which didn't receive any money. In other words, he was looking at comparable areas. He says, North Carolina and Georgia have had more economic development, and they're out of the TVA area, and they're near it, but they're not in it, and they got no money. And they got developed better. And he concluded that those areas that got the money had people who, because they were dependent on the subsidy from the TVA, they had less incentive to leave the area and launch out into entrepreneurship of their own. And his opinion, and it's just an opinion, was he said, look, I'm just observing that North Carolina and Georgia have had better economic development than Tennessee and Western Kentucky. And so he said, TVA may have given those people subsidies, and it may have helped lower their cost of living, as a subsidy inevitably will do. But it has not produced economic development more rapid than the areas that didn't get the subsidy. It's just something to think about that's interesting. I thank you for that question.
Okay, we have another question. It says, do you see any reasons why the realm of healthcare is somehow different from other businesses or economic sectors and therefore appropriate for government intervention? Most countries have answered with yes.
The funny thing is this came right after the TVA question. I think the case for the TVA is better than the healthcare. Because the TVA, I'll say something for TVA with James II. I want to say this. I mean, you have at least one point in your favor all the time, and that is that the cost of living is less because of the federal subsidy that Western Tennessee and Kentucky is getting. So, I mean, at least that's a point that you always have. The healthcare has been, once you try to have a subsidized healthcare, the incentives all over the country go wild. Because, let's put it this way, just at a basic level, if you get a subsidy for, England, let me use glasses. England started their healthcare with free glasses after World War II. And one of the things they found that was interesting is that once people got free glasses, they said, I don't have any, in their mind, they thought they were occurring with all sorts of huge breakage rates. Because if the glasses are free, you don't have incentive to take care of them. And so they were having to supply more glasses because everybody was claiming their glasses were broken. Then they found out that the people who were claiming their glasses were broken really wanted a pair so they could have a pair of glasses downstairs and a pair of glasses upstairs. So then they said, you have to bring in the broken glasses. Then you'd have people bringing in the same pair of broken glasses, then transferring it to someone else. So then you have to have somebody added to the bureaucracy to put labels on the broken glasses and mark them so that you can't bring in the same pair. Now, do you see, we're expanding government and we're not solving anything. Healthcare produces a little bit of the same incentives. For example, if I have, just take it at the simple level of dental care. If I have free dental care, which I have had in my days, my early days as a college professor, and I can get free dental care, then I don't quite have as much subsidy to reduce cavities. And so we have you naturally have people then using more health care because the price provides a subsidy. Now, if hospitals can advertise prices and we compete on the basis of prices instead of adding subsidies, then we would get competition coming in the other direction. We've never gone in that direction fully enough. I think healthcare is something that, although most countries have put it in, they end up coming to the United States. It's funny, some of you may have heard Mark Stein. He lived a long time in Canada, and he said, the interesting thing about living in Canada is that when anybody has a problem under our subsidized system, it's subsidized, so you have to wait in line because you have so many people wanting the subsidized care. He said they have to come over to the United States to get their health care. And then he asked, once the United States has health care federally subsidized, where will we go to get our health care then? An interesting question, but it is interesting that so many people in the countries with the state-run healthcare systems come over to the United States because the entrepreneurship seems to be going on here. So I think that the TVA example is actually a little bit better than the healthcare.
We had another comment come in along those lines as well, that the space programs and the claim that microwaves and Tang were invented because of that. That's also perhaps, a successful investment on the occasion. So I think that kind of plays off of that. There are some, we'll say, isolated examples.
I'm not trying to argue. Every federal subsidy in every particular is bad. And every privately supported business in every particular is better. My argument is that private subsidies and privately operated business in a privately operated economy will function much better, and by the way, will be fairer to more people than the government-run system. But there will be gains under a government-run system, and the space program could be one. I'm going to be interested in seeing what Elon Musk is able to accomplish. But of course, he has some federal aid. It's a good question. Some of that we're just going to we'll have to wait on Elon Musk to see what he can accomplish. But I would say it's true that the space program has had some benefits. I think I'd rather, we've also spent trillions of dollars. Is Tang worth trillions of dollars? But yeah, I think there's some benefits from the program. I just don't think they outweigh the costs.
It's interesting that you mentioned Elon Musk, because that's kind of, I guess if you're going to write a sequel to your book, I imagine he would probably have a very large role in that, with both his space programs and then also he's got something in Chicago where he's wanted a tunnel underneath the city. So he's kind of has his hands in many different atmospheres.
He is, I think 100 years ago, at 150, he would have been a great entrepreneur, and he still might be today. Because the government is so intrusive today, it's hard for great entrepreneurs not to get entangled. And I think that may be what's happening to Elon Musk. In my classes, in teaching at Hillsdale College, and in my lectures that I've done with Kennesaw State for the Bagwell Center, I have tended to be a little bit negative on Musk. But every time I have my good students always come up to me and say, Dr. Folsom, give Musk a chance. I really think he can do it. And I've had enough good students, I mean, students who I really respect, they write good essays and they're thoughtful people. they have confidence enough in Musk that I'm moving from saying, I don't think so, to, hey, let's wait and see.
Some of the earlier examples you touched on kind of deal with a period of American history where, the safety precautions and the labor regulations just weren't really in existence at the time. Do you think government has a role in regulating workplace safety?
It's a good question, and I would start by saying let's consider some other alternatives too. In other words, I want to not answer that question by saying no. I want to say, are there ways to do it in a market system without having the government involved? And the reason I say that is, and I say everybody thinks it's possible you could have some safety problem and then a government official could come in and say, no, this needs to be changed. But the reason I want at least to think in other patterns here is also the possibility here is that you get a government official that comes in and says, I'm going to look the other way if you will pay me some money. In fact, we had that, my wife and I, on our home that we built, we had people who were supposed to check to make sure homes are in compliance when we were building one in Michigan. And the guy, in effect, didn't do anything. A lot of government agents are getting a salary and they don't necessarily have an incentive to do a good job. In meat packing, for example, we've had situations where we've had technology come in that we can now examine the quality of meat electronically much better than having to go through individually. But the government agents don't want the electronic devices in there because then they might be put out of a job. Now, I merely say that to say there may be possibilities. Let me give one example, and this is just food for thought. In the building industry, that's where I'm trying to pick something where you really want to make sure safety standards are in there. If you're in a building, you want to know it has a good foundation. You want to know your builder has done the job well. One possibility is to have a government inspector come by, but he might be able to be fooled or bought off. Another possibility is, what if you had private enterprise agency that judged buildings and evaluated them and graded them themselves? So that, in other words, if you're building a building, you're saying, I want to try to get an approval rating from this agency, which is privately operated. That agency has every incentive to get it right, because if they get it wrong, they're done for. Whereas if a government agency gets it wrong, you simply say, oh, I'm sorry, that guy was corrupt. Let's send a new bureaucrat in, and maybe he won't be. But if you have an agency that is dealing in the business of grading and giving approval ratings for buildings, then they're going to have every incentive to inspect that thing and make it right. If you get an approval from that agency, not government, then you could say, forget the government, say, this agency has given me an approval rating, and therefore they authorize and approve buildings, and all of their buildings that they approve are up to code. They have their own code standards. I've met the code standards, therefore I have a safe building. You don't have the government in there, and you're putting two private agencies in business. I'm suggesting this. I guess I'm trying to get people to think outside the box. Are there ways other than having a bureaucrat attend to things? And I also want to make the point that some of the biggest improvements in private enterprise have been made by entrepreneurs who improve the industry. In mining, coal mining, one of the biggest disasters was mines that blew up because cartridge powder got in, and you had blow up and a loss of lives. One of the biggest improvements in cartridge powders were done by a man named Henry Boyes, B-O-I-E-S, who was an owner of mines and an owner of a powder company. He had an invention that decreased the accidents, and that improved his business. So I'm saying entrepreneurs on their own have some incentive to produce the improved products. We've all seen how cans are very lightweight. Well, they're lightweight because if you use a lot of metal, that's inefficient. People who make a Coke can have incentives to do lightweight and efficient cans because it saves them money. A lot of people can correct this on their own. I don't want to 100% rule out a government regulator, but I'm saying usually I think there are more often than not better ways to improve the quality and safety of the businesses that we operate.
Yeah, very good. This next question will basically take us out of the United States and put us in Nigeria now. This question is from our actual PERI research fellow, Shamsuddin. He writes, my country, Nigeria, which is Africa's largest oil producer, has a problem with its subsidy on the importation of petroleum products. It is planning to remove it as it leads to the total collapse of the local refineries in the country and is considered a major platform used by politicians and businessmen for corruption. The citizens are protesting this decision. Do you have any advice for the Nigerian government?
I'm not sure. Let me see if I exactly understand this. You have if the petroleum industry in Nigeria is private, but they're talking about exporting their oil and the platform. I'm just trying to.
Has a problem with its subsidy on the importation of petroleum products.
Why would they want to import if they're exporting? I guess that was one of the things that threw me.
Sham, you're open. Yeah, you're welcome to type in a follow-up to that if you want.
Sham.
If not, we may have to pass on that at this time.
Let me just make an interesting comment.
Sure.
Or I hope is. We had an oil crisis under Jimmy Carter in 1979, 1980. And the first thing that President Reagan did in 1981 was he decontrolled oil, which meant that the prices would go up, but drillers would eventually, he hoped, drill for oil and the price would go down. That's exactly what happened. But one other benefit happened. George Mitchell, who was a driller in Texas, began fracking. He began fracking the very moment that the oil price was decontrolled. 17 years later, his oil fields in Texas with fracking became open. And that's the beginning of American independence in oil. We not only got the low prices that President Reagan thought we would get when he decontrolled oil, we got an explosion in innovative ways to create more oil. Fracking came in, and the United States is our energy independence today, which is there, enormously changes the world. We used to import almost half our oil. We were dependent on the Middle East. President Trump, you notice that President Trump is having an amazing effect in the Middle East, negotiating treaties here. President Trump is negotiating from strength in part because the United States is no longer oil dependent.
And we got a follow-up comment from Shams. He said the Nigerian exports crude oil, but imports refined oil. And then Justin actually commented that Nigeria does not have the necessary refinery infrastructure to make that happen.
To refine the oil.
Yeah, he says Shams is talking about the subsidy on the importation of refined oil, and our refineries could no longer produce refined oil.
You know, that what you have to do there is invest as much as possible to get the people who can do your refineries. We've had in the United States, unfortunately, people trying to block the building of refineries. And so we haven't been building new refineries, and that could be a problem down the line for us. That's where Nigeria could come in and take market share from us.
All right. I don't believe we have any more questions coming in at the time. And we're about, I think we're about out of time here. So Dr. Folsom, I thank you very much for your presentation. That was very interesting. I'm a former history student myself, so I love that kind of stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Dan. And hey, you people who are watching, thank you for coming to see this. I'm really grateful. I mean that. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you, Dr. Folsom. It's always a pleasure listening to you, and I'm always inspired for the PhD students in the audience. This is like the classic old style way of teaching where no PowerPoints, no notes, literally know the material, and you're giving it emphasis and jokes, and it's so impressive how good you are, even virtually. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'll have to have you again.
Thank you for inviting me, Dan. I really do want to work with you more.
All right. Thank you for attending. Have a good evening.
Good night.
Thank you all.